Welcome to Solutions OP Clinical Trials Podcast. My name is Olga and I'm the Managing Director of Solutions OP. We are a small team of experienced professionals working on clinical trials in the United Kingdom. I'll use our podcast to discuss hot topics in clinical trials and provide analysis of the latest trends and challenges in pharma and medical device industries, not just in the UK but globally. Thank you for listening. Welcome to the latest episode of the podcast. The topic of today's episode is the opportunities and the challenges in conducting clinical trials in Africa, and what's been done so far to improve the access to clinical trials to their patients. And of course, as you know, I always like to provide my own recommendations and just give my perspective, what I think could be useful and could help countries in Africa to improve their way of running clinical trials. So I'll include that one as well in my discussion. So according to a recent publication that I came across, Africa has 14% of the world's population, but it also has 20% of the global burden of diseases. So in comparison, they only have 30% of all clinical trials conducted in Africa. So that's a very small percentage, as you can imagine. And I think it's evident that they need to provide better access to their patients if they want to have more clinical trials and new treatments for their patients. They need to provide a better infrastructure and generally improve the way they conduct clinical research. So, of course, they have done a lot of work, the countries in Africa, to create a regulatory structure which is similar to European Medicines Agency, and I'll discuss this in a bit more details in a moment. Of course, this is a great initiative, collaboration between different countries. But while the lack of coordinated regulatory bodies can address some of the challenges that they have, in terms of clinical trials, there are other issues that need to be resolved as well, like the research ethics malpractices that can put patients at risk, for example. But I think probably it's better if I discuss a little bit in more details the biggest challenges of conducting clinical research in Africa. So the first, my first point is the fragmented network. So we have different countries with different requirements that they may not be aligned, which creates a big burden to conduct clinical research. And if you want to run a clinical trial in several countries, then that will be a lot of work and additional funding that is needed for the pharma company. So it makes it more complicated for the pharma companies when they have to follow the different regulations and requirements in each individual country. So that's definitely a very big challenge. But another big challenge is the clinical research malpractices, which are common in the African countries, and that makes it very difficult to justify using these countries in global clinical trials, simply due to the risk of for patients and also regulatory non-compliance. So for those of you who know, it's a very common practice when submitting a new medicinal product for approval to have inspection from the regulator at the different hospitals involved in the clinical trial. So if you have malpractices in terms of how you consent patients, the way you collect data and so on, if you have non-compliance, then your data may not be accepted by the regulator, which means the marketing authorization application could be rejected, and even the companies could be forced to do more clinical trials to provide additional data. So as you can see, that brings a big risk for the pharma companies to conduct clinical trials in Africa, unless they're looking to get their product approved in Africa. But as a part of a global clinical trial, it's challenging. Having that kind of problems is really challenging. Another interesting point here I would like to make is the push for decolonization, which resulted in withdrawal of support from Western countries and handing over the management of clinical research to local authorities, which don't necessarily have the expertise to do the job, and they don't also have the funding to build the structures and support clinical research. So that's a very big challenge that countries are left on their own to manage their own research, and they don't necessarily know how to do that. While there's still funding going to the African countries, it's more focused on social issues than the urgent medical issues that the population has. So it's a bit of a disbalance. Personally, my view is that I wish we have more funding to support developing a clinical research network rather than dealing with some social issues who, even though they're important, they might not be that a burning problem for the patients in Africa. So my next point is that another challenge is the low literacy level. And it's very hard to explain to people to understand research and to obtain informed consent if they don't understand some basic medical terminology and how the healthcare system works and so on. So it is hard. That's definitely a big challenge. Another very important point that we have to make is when we talk about Africa as a continent, there are many countries, and these countries, they have different standard of care. So having data from different countries with different quality of care and standard of care could be very challenging. So, for example, if you have data from Burundi or South Africa, that the quality of the data will be very different. The standard of care will be very different between these two countries. So that's another potential challenge if you have different standard of care in the countries. Another important part is the lack of financial and human resources for running clinical trials, which could lead to poor protection for patients participating in clinical trials. So here we need to think about the Western practices of hiring medical professionals from Africa and the impact that this has on African patients. Now, from the point of view of Western institutions, it's very easy to say, well, we hire people because they're qualified and it might be cheaper if we hire people from abroad. But the reality is these specialists are actually much needed in Africa. And to me, that's a bit of an ethical issue as well, if you're taking resources from a place where they don't have these resources to begin with. Connected to this point is the next one, which is the lack of expertise of the regulators, which could also affect the research. So, for example, if you have a regulator which is not aware with the challenges of protocols designed by artificial intelligence, or they're not familiar with the weaknesses of the artificial intelligence of developing different clinical trials documents, this could be a big problem. And I'll give an example. I've seen more and more documents developed by artificial intelligence which are not necessarily good quality. In fact, some of them, when you read them, they sound like reasonable. But if you think about it, then you realize that something's not right with them. So whoever have created the document didn't really put that much effort into the reviewing everything properly and aligning things, and probably they just read it and say, oh, okay, that sounds reasonable. But I've seen, unfortunately, such low quality documents, especially in medical devices. Sadly, this is the problem. So another big challenge is the creation of harmonized regulatory framework, and that challenge is triggered by the competitiveness between the different countries and also the lack of trust between some countries in the region. So if you have that kind of dynamic, it's really hard to have a harmonized regulatory framework which everyone will follow and use. So another thing I would like to mention here is we should not underestimate the cost associated with compliance. And this is something we easily overlook, especially for all of us in Western Europe or in Western countries where we're quite accustomed to the cost of manufacturing and so on. So following international standards like good manufacturing practice will add to the overall price of the medicines manufactured in Africa, and that will make them less affordable for African countries. So the natural preference for all these African countries is to use generic drugs which are off patent rather than the expensive branded drugs. But overall, if they have to imply the same standards for manufacturing drugs like the Western Europe and the US and so on, this will definitely increase the price. Now, I have to be honest here and say I'm always very skeptical when it comes to not following standards, because if you're not following standards, then inevitably you put patients at risk. And we've seen many tragedies around the world in developing countries where drugs which are not properly manufactured and controlled, they've been given to patients, there have been so many death cases and so on. So my personal view is I would rather prefer if everyone follows some at least basic requirements for manufacturing, which will prevent such incidents. But that is a cost associated with it, and I completely understand this. Another complication is the political and strategic influence over local regulators that could create opportunities for corruption and political interference. So in the Western countries, we have strict anti-corruption regulations, and if any pharma company doesn't meet the requirements, then they're faced with public humiliation and big fines. So you can easily see how using local representatives in African countries who are more accustomed, let's say, to bribing and other corruption practices, this could have a very negative impact on the country. And also on the way the clinical research is conducted in the country. Companies could be fined for malpractices even if these malpractices are in different regions. So if you're a pharma company and it comes into knowledge that you have representatives in some African country who've been bribing officials, this is really damaging for your reputation. So that's a very big challenge for pharma companies and risk, which I think many would want to avoid. But when we come to medical complications, I think it's important to mention something very interesting here. Africa has a significant genetic diversity. And this is especially true about cytochrome P450 membrane enzymes, which are involved in drug metabolism, and they are located predominantly in the liver, but also in the intestine and kidneys. So these genetic differences mean that the drug is metabolized in a different way. So patients can have different drug response, depends on their genetic makeup. And the data generated from one country in Africa might not necessarily be relevant for all other populations in Africa. And that is very interesting, a very interesting challenge. But on the other hand, it shows you that you really need to have a diverse population in clinical trials if you want to have the drug approved for different countries and for different patient populations, because even though we all look the same, we actually could have different metabolism, and the way the drugs work on us could be completely different. So that's a very interesting point I wanted to mention. So while the challenges are complex, there is some work that is done to support clinical research in Africa, and I would like to cover a little bit this one as well. So what has been done so far in Africa to improve the perspectives for running clinical trials? So the one of the first things is that the African regulatory agencies are more involved in developing international harmonized standards as part of World Health Organization and the International Council for Harmonization, which gives them more experience in the field. So there are several region harmonization initiatives as well. For example, Zazibona, which involves Zambia, Zimbabwe, Botswana, and Namibia, is one of the initiatives. And there is another one which is called East African Community, and they're all looking to harmonize regulations between the different countries in the region. So that's these are some very good initiatives which will give more experience to the regulators in the African countries. Another very important thing to mention here is the African Medicines Regulatory Harmonization Initiative, which was established in 2009, and it aims to create a common technical standards across the countries, including adopting a legal systems like African Union model law. So the idea here is that this agency will act like the European Medicines Agency, and as of May 2025, 39 countries have signed or ratified the African Medicines Agency treaty, and the agency will be established in Rwanda. So this is something that is currently in development, and hopefully we'll have more news in the coming years on how this African Medicines Agency will operate. The African continent is consisting of 55 countries, which makes collaboration more complicated. But there are agreements that could be used as a model for harmonization. And the best example for this is the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which basically established Africa as the biggest single market, and it became effective in 2021. So this could be used as a successful model and collaboration for establishing the African Medicines Agency, which hopefully will also be a successful initiative. Another example for improvements is the collaboration and knowledge sharing. For example, the World Health Organization-led joint assessments in Ghana and Nigeria have shown to be very positive and very good for the countries, and also provide a learning opportunity for their regulators. So as you can see, there are a lot of challenges, but there are some work going on in Africa affecting different African countries. So of course, it's not something that could be resolved immediately. They're complicated problems. But here I would like to provide also some recommendations from my side on what I think could be done to help African countries on their quest of creating a better structure and better system for conducting clinical trials. So one of the first things that they can do is to create a single product dossier that could be used among all African regulators, and it will streamline the process. So that's basically to have a single structure of required documents for conducting clinical trials, which could be implemented for all countries. So we have something similar in the US and Europe and Australia. If you go and say, well, I need to submit a clinical trial, people can always spell out what kind of documents you need to submit. So even if there are some slight differences between the different regions in terms of documents, you know what the core documents are and you know what you need to prepare. So that's important thing to have. Another thing that I believe could be achieved in Africa is creating clinical trials hub in each country, which is dedicated to clinical trials only and staffed with experienced professionals and that will be a great opportunity to build knowledge and expertise in clinical research and clinical trials. So even if you have a big country, you can always start with one clinical trials hub, which will be used to train staff on clinical research and to improve the expertise in the country. Then you can always roll it into different hospitals and try to create some local hubs. But I think having one hub initially, one place where you have the resources, you have the expertise, you can use it to train people on clinical research. I think this will be a massive benefit for the African countries, just having that one hub as a starting point. Now, another thing that, of course, could be done is pharmaceutical companies conducting clinical trials in Africa could make sure all local regulations are followed and participants are protected. They can achieve this by frequent inspections and close monitoring of the hospitals involved in the study. Now, I understand that this is a very tricky thing because not all pharma companies have the funding and the resources to afford to do this. Maybe for some big corporations this will work fine. For many small companies, however, this will be a challenge. And yet, it's a starting point. So if someone starts doing this and start helping and supporting and training people, this will inevitably bring more companies and more interest in the region, because there will be more resources and people will know what they're doing, and that makes a big difference when you speak to someone and you see they understand their work. Another recommendation that I have is creating a simplified guideline for informed consent, which will provide the structure and ideas on how to easily explain research to patients with low literacy level. And here there are plenty of opportunities that we have now. You can have a short video in local language where you can explain to people simple things like what does it mean to have a physical examination, for example, or what is this measuring blood pressure, how do you measure blood pressure. So simple things like that you can explain in what is done in clinical research could be extremely beneficial. It could be a short video, or it could be photos, like a simple photo guide where you can explain using the pictures. So there are opportunities that you can make sure people understand what they're consenting for and what's being done in the clinical research. And my last point, which I think is also very important, is the mutual recognition procedures. So these procedures are very successful in the Western countries, and I think they can be implemented in Africa too. There's no reason why not. So, for example, if the countries can accept drugs approved by US FDA and require some post-marketing surveillance study conducted in the country to provide some additional data from local patient populations, this will be very attractive for the pharma companies, because they can get an approval faster and they can later on provide additional safety data for the patients. So particularly for clinical trials for drugs which have been tested extensively on different patient populations and so on, it makes sense if there is some kind of recognition and companies could actually use this as a recognition procedure between the different regions. So, in conclusion, what I can say is that Africa as a continent has a lot of potential in conducting clinical research and improving the lives of patients, but it requires a better collaboration between the different countries, and this is a very key thing. Another very important part is to have funding and resources, And this is something that the African governments need to consider. A risk-based assessment clearly shows that great benefit in investing in clinical research, not only for the patients, but really for the economical development of the country. But again, this is down to the local governments who have to make these decisions and find information and learn more about it, because I am aware that maybe many of them will not understand the real benefit and the impact of clinical research that could have on their economy and also on their patients. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope this was an interesting topic.